Imagine this. You go to sleep thinking you're prepared. You're diversified. You're doing the responsible thing. And then you wake up to a headline that changes the definition of ownership overnight. Not the price, not the tax rate, the definition. Suddenly, the thing you thought was private property is treated like a national resource. And you don't get to vote on it. You just get to deal with it. Because here's the uncomfortable reality most people don't want to say out loud. When a government decides something is strategic, that word can quietly become a lever. A lever that can move markets, rewrite rules, and put ordinary savers on the wrong side of a policy shift they never saw coming. It is Saturday, January 24th, 2026, and the exact time in New York is 9:50 p.m. Comment what time you're watching this, because timing matters more than most people realize. And real quick, I'm running a campaign to eliminate copycat channels. If you value what we do here, hit subscribe and comment, Our John AG. Now, in this video, we're going to break down why silver just got pushed into a category that changes how politicians and agencies talk about it, why the history everyone remembers is only part of the story, and what the playbook usually looks like before the public realizes the game has already started. And I'm going to challenge one of the most popular assumptions along the way, because the easiest fear to sell is the fear that sounds like history repeating perfectly. Also, check the description because I've dropped bonus links there, including a premium WhatsApp channel link and a channel membership join link. Keep that in your pocket for later, because the last part of this video is where things get practical. So let's jump in with the one sentence that should make you sit up straight. Silver being labeled strategic isn't about your coin collection. It's about supply chains, military readiness, power systems, and the kind of industrial bottlenecks that can turn into political emergencies fast. And if you think, okay, that's big picture stuff, it doesn't touch me, then you're exactly the person these stories hit hardest. Because rule changes don't start by targeting you. They start by targeting the word priority. And when priority shows up, control is usually not far behind. Now, before anybody clips a 5-second segment and pretends I'm predicting a raid tomorrow morning, breathe. I'm not here to panic you. I'm here to make sure you're not surprised. There's a difference. Surprise is expensive. Awareness is cheap. Let's talk about the ghost everyone brings up first. 1933. Most people know the basic outline. Crisis, banking chaos, a signature, and suddenly gold ownership for regular Americans was boxed in by law. And what makes that story so powerful isn't just the policy itself. It's how fast it happened, how normal it felt once it was announced, and how many people complied because the government didn't need to kick doors to get most of what it wanted. That's the lesson, not the drama, the mechanism. When a system is stressed, authorities reach for whatever can stabilize their position. Sometimes that's interest rates. Sometimes that's propaganda. Sometimes it's capital controls. And sometimes it's a legal reclassification that turns a personal asset into a public necessity. And here's where people get the story wrong in a way that matters today. They assume the next move, if it ever happens, would look exactly like the last move. Same speeches, same executive order vibe, same straightforward turn-it-in framing. I'm skeptical of that. If a modern government wanted more metal flow into official channels, there are cleaner tools now. Tools that don't create the same backlash and don't require the same obvious confrontation. And that's why the word strategic is so important, because it opens the door to softer forms of control that still change your outcome. Let me explain. When an asset becomes strategic, it can become subject to priority allocation. That's a fancy way of saying industry gets first dibs. Defense contractors get first dibs. Critical infrastructure gets first dibs. And if that gets formalized during a disruption, the government doesn't have to confiscate your silver to affect your silver. It can choke liquidity, regulate dealers, require reporting thresholds, restrict exports, and create a two-tier market where the approved channel trades one way and the unapproved channel trades another way. Same destination, different road. Now, why is silver even in this conversation in the first place? Because silver isn't just a shiny metal. It's one of the most electrically conductive materials used at scale. It shows up in high reliability connectors, in certain medical applications, in electronics, in specialized coatings, and most importantly for policymakers right now, it shows up in the clean energy industrial push that governments have tied their reputations to. Solar manufacturing is a perfect example. You can argue about politics all day, but the physical reality doesn't care. Solar panels require conductive pastes and connections, and silver has been a key ingredient in those systems for a long time. Manufacturers keep working to thrift it down and substitute where possible, but the demand is still real. And when you combine that with grid upgrades, data centers, electrification, and defense procurement, you get a metal that quietly moves from commodity to constraint. And constraints create policy. Here's the next piece most people miss. Strategic declarations tend to appear before the public feels the shortage. Governments don't wait for a warehouse to be empty. They move when they see the risk curve bending the wrong way. They move when they see concentrated supply, geopolitical friction, and rising dependency. So when you hear strategic, don't picture a label. Picture a warning light on a dashboard. Now, let's talk about the supply side, because this is where the emotional argument turns into a math problem. Silver production is not like printing money. You can't snap your fingers and double output by next quarter. A lot of silver comes as a byproduct of other mining operations. That means even if silver prices surge, output doesn't instantly surge in response. The pipeline is slow, permitting is slow, development is slow, and for years, the market has leaned on inventories and recycling to fill gaps. That's a fragile arrangement. Because inventories are finite, recycling depends on economics, and industrial users don't like uncertainty. If manufacturers think supply will be tight later, they secure contracts earlier, and that can create the very squeeze everyone says can't happen. And this is why strategic matters. It signals that policymakers have noticed the fragility too. But let's not pretend this is a one-country story. Silver is global, mining jurisdictions are global, refining capacity is global. And when global politics gets messy, metals become bargaining chips. Not because they're shiny, but because they're useful. Now, before we go further, I need you to picture how modern policy actually spreads. It rarely starts with a dramatic announcement. It starts with a technical memo, then an agency update, then a compliance notice, then an industry roundtable, then a temporary measure, and then, one day, you realize the temporary measure has been renewed 3 times, and everyone acts like it's normal. That's the real cliffhanger. Not will they do it, but will you notice the steps before the door closes? So, if we're talking about silver and potential government control, we need to separate 3 very different scenarios. Scenario 1, outright confiscation. Classic, blunt, politically explosive. It makes headlines. It creates backlash. It requires a strong justification. Scenario 2, forced mobilization of flows, meaning industry is prioritized, certain sales channels are restricted, and compliance burdens make private trading harder. This can happen quietly and can be framed as stabilization. Scenario 3, financial pressure. Taxes, reporting requirements, transaction limits, and incentives that push metal back into official channels without ever calling it confiscation. Most people only talk about scenario 1. The real world often leans on scenarios 2 and 3. And that brings us back to history, because the history lesson isn't, they did it once, so they'll do it again. The history lesson is, in crisis, the rule book becomes flexible. Now, let's address the line that's been making the rounds. Silver has been declared a strategic mineral, so your silver could be seized. Could it? Legally, governments often have broad emergency powers. Practically, it depends on political costs, enforcement feasibility, and what the government actually needs. Here's the counterpoint you won't hear enough. Seizing small private holdings is inefficient. If the goal is to feed industrial demand, the biggest levers are upstream: mining output, refining, industrial contracts, and large-scale inventories held by institutions. That's where the volume is. That's where the policy pressure goes first. So if you're picturing agents tracking down a handful of coins, that's not the likely starting point. The likely starting point is control of commercial pipelines. But, big but, individuals can still get caught in the net if the rules are written broadly. And that's what you need to understand. Even if you're not the target, you can be affected. For example, imagine a temporary requirement that major dealers must report certain purchases and sales in the name of anti-hoarding or market stability. That doesn't confiscate anything, but it changes behavior. It changes liquidity. It changes premiums. It changes who wants to transact. Imagine another measure. Restrictions on exporting certain forms of silver during a supply shock. That doesn't seize your metal, but it changes the domestic market and can tighten supply. Imagine a third measure. Government procurement programs that outbid the market for industrial-grade material, pulling available supply into official stockpiles. Again, not confiscation, but it can feel like it because your ability to buy at reasonable spreads disappears. And this is where the fear narrative often gets weaponized. Some people will use the word confiscation as a sales tactic. They'll try to stampede you into buying at any price, with any premium, from any source, because fear makes people rush. Don't do that. If you want to own silver, own it because it fits your plan, your risk tolerance, and your time horizon, not because someone played a dramatic soundtrack over a headline. Now, let's talk about what's actually different between the 1930s and now, because this is where the nuance matters. Back then, the monetary system and gold ownership were directly tied in a way that made a single move extremely powerful. Today, the financial system runs on digital rails. Most money lives as ledger entries, and that changes what control looks like. It's easier now to control transactions than to control objects. That's why if authorities ever want to push metal into certain channels, they don't necessarily need to seize the metal. They can squeeze the on-ramps and off-ramps. Payments, reporting, tax treatment, dealer regulation, storage rules, transport rules, insurance rules. Suddenly, the easy trade becomes the hard trade, and people self-select into compliance because friction is a form of enforcement. So the question becomes, what triggers those kinds of moves? Usually it's some combination of three things. 1. A supply shock that threatens a politically important goal, like energy build-out or defense readiness. 2. A currency confidence problem that makes people run toward hard assets at scale. 3. A war or severe geopolitical break that forces governments to prioritize resources. And here's the twist. You don't need all three. You need one, with the right narrative. Now let's talk about that narrative, because narratives are the bridge between law and compliance. In the 1930s, the narrative was stabilize the system. In modern times, the narrative could be protect the grid, defend national security, accelerate clean energy, or prevent economic sabotage. The words change, the function stays the same. And the reason silver is such a perfect candidate for narrative framing is because it has a dual identity. It's both a monetary metal in the public imagination and an industrial input in the policy world. That dual identity makes it easier to justify intervention because officials can say they're not targeting savers, they're protecting critical supply. Now here's where we need to get real about the market itself, because the market is already telling you a story. Silver is notorious for volatility. It surges, it collapses, it fakes you out, it spikes on headlines, and then it drifts when people get bored. That behavior is exactly why so many people underestimate it. They see it as chaos. But chaos can be a signal. When a market is tight, it doesn't always show up as a smooth climb. It often shows up as sudden gap moves, weird premiums, delays in certain products, and frantic attention swings. The signal isn't always the spot price. Sometimes the signal is the spread between forms, the availability, the way dealers change terms. And when policy risk is added to that, the signal becomes even messier, because traders price headlines faster than fundamentals. Now, I want to hit you with a perspective shift that will keep you from getting emotionally manipulated. Ask yourself this. If the government truly needed silver urgently, what would be the fastest way to get it? Not chasing down individuals. The fastest way is to outbid and redirect, secure supply at the source, subsidize domestic refining, offer contracts to producers, create stockpiles, mandate priority allocations for key industries, and if necessary, impose temporary restrictions on certain forms of trade. Those tools exist in many countries. They're not science fiction. They're part of how industrial policy works. So the real risk isn't a dramatic confiscation event tomorrow. The real risk is a gradual shift where owning silver remains legal, but the market structure around it changes in ways that shock people who weren't watching. That's the cliffhanger you need to care about. And if you're thinking, okay, John, then what do I do? Hold that thought, because in a minute, I'm going to give you a simple framework that keeps you rational no matter which direction the headlines swing. But first, we need to address the part of the story that makes people emotional. The idea that they'll revalue it after taking it. This is where a lot of misinformation gets mixed with real history. The emotional memory is that people handed over gold at one price and then the system changed. Here's the modern version of that fear. They'll cap you, then reset. Could that happen with silver? Theoretically, governments can change monetary rules, taxation, and official pricing mechanisms for certain transactions, but the pathway matters. Silver is deeply embedded in global trade and manufacturing. Any attempt to set silver in a heavy-handed way would collide with international markets and industrial demand. So again, I'm skeptical that the future looks like a clean repeat. The future, if it gets ugly, is more likely to look like layered controls, incentives, and restrictions that push flows where authorities want them. And that brings us to the legal toolbox, because people hear emergency powers and they either dismiss it or they panic. Neither reaction helps you. Emergency powers don't guarantee confiscation. They guarantee optionality. They guarantee the government has buttons it can press when it wants speed. And when speed becomes politically valuable, those buttons get pressed. Now, without turning this into a law lecture, there are categories of authority that tend to expand during crisis. National defense prioritization, disaster response authority, international economic emergency tools, and supply chain intervention frameworks. Those categories give governments the ability to prioritize, allocate, requisition in certain contexts, and control financial flows. The important part for you is not memorizing acronyms. The important part is recognizing that the framework exists in many places, and it can be activated quickly. So what's the smart move? The smart move is not to become paranoid. The smart move is to become disciplined. Let me give you the discipline framework. First, define why you own silver. Is it insurance? Is it speculation? Is it a long-term hedge against currency debasement? Is it a diversification tool? If you can't answer that in one sentence, you're going to be tossed around by every headline. Second, define how you hold it. Not in a hide-it way, in a prudent, legal, risk-managed way. Secure storage, proper documentation for insurance, awareness of local rules, and an understanding that anything involving finance has compliance layers you can't ignore. Third, define your liquidity plan. If you needed to convert some of it, how would you do it? Through what channels? Under what conditions? If you don't have a plan, you'll end up selling at the worst time, usually when fear is highest and spreads are widest. Fourth, define your diversification. Metals are not a religion. They're a tool. Tools work best in a toolbox, not as the only thing you own. Now, notice what I did not say. I did not say, do this illegal trick. Because the moment you cross into how to evade, you're not being smart, you're being reckless. And reckless people get punished first when rules tighten. So keep it clean, keep it legal, keep it calm. Now let's bring in the fresh context that matters for 2026, because the world that drives these decisions is changing fast. We're in an era where governments are competing over manufacturing capacity. The phrase reshoring isn't a slogan, it's a policy direction. Countries want control over the inputs that power their grids, their weapons systems, their chips, and their industrial competitiveness. At the same time, the electricity demand story is changing. Data centers are expanding. AI compute is energy hungry. Grid modernization isn't optional if electrification continues. And when you build out high-tech power infrastructure, you run into materials constraints. Silver isn't the only constraint, but it's a notable one. And here's a detail people ignore. When supply chains get stressed, governments don't always solve the stress by creating more supply. They often solve it by controlling distribution. Because creating supply takes years, controlling distribution can be done in weeks. That's why strategic designations are often the first domino. Now, add another ingredient, defense. Military procurement doesn't like uncertainty. It likes guaranteed delivery. When geopolitical tensions rise, defense priorities shift, budgets expand, and certain components become non-negotiable. Silver, as part of high-reliability electronics, becomes one of many inputs that matter. So you have energy policy, industrial policy, and defense policy all tugging in the same direction. Secure critical inputs. That's the macro pressure. Now, let's zoom into the micro, because this is where viewers usually feel the story. If you're a stacker, a saver, someone who buys physical metal, your world is premiums, availability, trust in dealers, and the feeling that you're stepping outside the financial system a bit. And that's exactly why the idea of confiscation triggers people. Because the whole point of owning physical is to reduce counterparty risk. So, is physical silver still worth considering? It can be, but you need to understand its risk profile honestly. Physical reduces certain risks and adds others. It reduces reliance on digital systems and financial intermediaries, but it adds storage risk, liquidity friction, and policy risk in some scenarios. That's not a reason to avoid it. It's a reason to be intentional. Now here comes the part where I'm going to challenge the panic narrative directly. If you believe governments are likely to confiscate silver from individuals en masse, ask yourself, why haven't they already done the easier version? The easier version would be to heavily tax gains, restrict certain transactions, and regulate dealers so tightly that private markets shrink. Those moves are far more politically palatable and far more enforceable. And in many places, versions of those controls already exist. So if you want to forecast the future, don't start with the most dramatic outcome. Start with the most realistic path of least resistance. That realistic path is usually reporting, taxation, restrictions on large transactions, and prioritized industrial allocation. Which means your risk isn't, they'll take my coins tomorrow. Your risk is, my options could narrow quickly under a crisis narrative. That distinction matters because it changes what preparation looks like. Preparation looks like staying informed, keeping your financial life organized, not overextending into one asset, and making sure you're not forced into bad decisions by lack of liquidity. Now, let's add another layer that most channels won't discuss because it complicates the fear story: substitution and innovation. When a material becomes a bottleneck, engineers get paid to work around it. In solar, for instance, manufacturers continuously try to reduce silver usage per unit. In electronics, designers can sometimes swap materials, alter designs, or optimize for availability. It's not always easy, and it doesn't remove demand, but it can soften it. So even if demand is strong, it's not a straight line. The story is dynamic. And that's why I say be careful with absolute claims. Anyone who says silver will definitely be seized is selling certainty they don't have. Anyone who says silver can never be controlled is ignoring history and policy reality. The truth lives in the middle. Policy risk exists, and it rises during stress. Now, we need to talk about one more driver that could turn this from theoretical to urgent: a monetary confidence event. When trust in currency weakens, people reach for alternatives, and when enough people do that, authorities react. Sometimes they react by tightening monetary policy, sometimes by loosening it, sometimes by restricting capital movement, and sometimes by targeting the escape valves. Physical metals can become an escape valve. If you've watched financial history, you know this rhythm: crisis, then control. The control doesn't always come first. It often comes after people start moving. So if you see a surge in demand for physical silver alongside a spike in economic stress, that's when policy attention can intensify. And here's where I want to ask you a question, because your answer tells me how people are thinking right now. Do you think the next major policy move around metals would be loud and obvious, or quiet and technical? Drop loud or quiet in the comments and tell me why. Now, I promised you practical guidance without crossing into nonsense, so here it is. If you own silver, don't build your whole strategy on one fear. Build your strategy on resilience. Resilience means you can handle price swings without panic. You can handle policy shifts without being trapped. You can handle liquidity needs without dumping at the bottom. You can handle unexpected expenses without selling your long-term insurance. And resilience also means community. If you've had any success, whether it's paying off debt, building a business, investing consistently, stacking responsibly, whatever it is, share your success story in the comments so others can stay motivated. People need proof that discipline works. Now, I also need to talk to the viewers who want the deepest research and the most detailed breakdowns. We offer members-only videos produced by a separate team with more research and more data, and those are only for premium members. If you want that level of detail without us watering it down for the algorithm, the join link is in the description. All right, back to the main thread. Let's explore what control could look like in a real crisis without turning this into fiction. One possibility is strategic stockpiling. Governments can buy material and remove it from the open market. That can tighten supply and push prices, but it can also stabilize key industries if managed well. Another possibility is priority allocation. Certain industries get priority contracts, and suppliers are incentivized or required to fulfill those first. Another possibility is export controls, which can reshape domestic pricing and availability. Another possibility is temporary transaction rules, limits on certain forms of trade during an emergency period. Notice something. None of these require taking your personal stash, but all of them can change the environment around your stash, and that's why the confiscation word is both useful and misleading. Useful because it grabs attention. Misleading because the more likely reality is a spectrum of control, not a single dramatic act. Now, let's address the ethical dimension for a second, because it's easy to turn this conversation into pure me versus them. But life gets complicated in real emergencies. If a country faces a true crisis, grid failure, war-level shortages, critical medical supply issues, resources get prioritized. People argue about fairness. People argue about corruption. People argue about who benefits. And sometimes those arguments are valid. But the moral question can still exist. If a strategic input is needed to keep hospitals running or infrastructure stable, what does responsible citizenship look like? I'm not answering that for you. I'm saying it's a question worth thinking about now, not when emotions are boiling. And that leads to the second engagement question I want you to answer. If there was a genuine, verified national emergency, and the government offered a fair market program to buy silver for critical infrastructure, would you participate? Yes or no, and explain your reasoning. Now, let's talk about what makes this entire topic feel so intense. Trust. People don't fear resource mobilization in a vacuum. They fear it because they don't trust the system to be honest about it. They fear it because past actions prove that narratives can be manipulated. They fear it because policies can be framed as temporary and then become permanent. So the solution isn't to blindly trust. The solution is to stay alert and stay rational. And that's why I keep coming back to signals. Watch legislation trends. Watch procurement announcements. Watch the language used around critical materials. Watch how agencies talk about supply chain resilience. Watch how quickly voluntary programs become requirements. Those are the tells. And please, don't let any single headline hijack your plan. Because the biggest mistake I see is people making all or nothing moves. They either buy aggressively at the top because they're terrified, or they sell everything at the bottom because they're exhausted. Both outcomes come from the same root problem. They never built a plan that could handle volatility. Now, speaking of volatility, here's something else that's fresh and relevant in early 2026. The broader commodity landscape is increasingly shaped by industrial policy. Governments are subsidizing certain supply chains, restricting others, and creating new demand through mandates and incentives. That policy-driven demand can make some commodity cycles feel different from the old, pure market cycles. But it can also create political blowback, and political blowback can trigger new rules. This is why I say, policy is a market factor now. Treat it like one. And you've already seen this movie with other resources, even if